The Pacific sky had a strange way of making a man feel alone. It stretched outward in every direction, an endless canvas of blue and white, broken only by the slow drift of clouds or the shimmering reflection of sunlight on waves far below. When flying with a squadron, a pilot felt part of a living machine. But when separated from the group, when the radios crackled uselessly and the horizon emptied of friendly wings, the Pacific became something else entirely. It became a silent grave. On the afternoon of February 23rd, 1945, 23-year-old Lieutenant Robert Bob McClure, flying a Grumman FM-2 Wildcat, found himself in exactly that position, alone, disoriented, and running out of fuel somewhere east of the Philippines. McClure wasn't inexperienced. He had flown dozens of sorties off the escort carrier USS Munda, CVE 104, providing air cover for amphibious operations and hunting down Japanese picket boats. But the Pacific was vast, and even the most seasoned pilots could become lost when weather rolled in suddenly. That day, a fast-moving fog bank, thick as cotton and blinding as steam, swept across the formation. The squadron commander turned them into a climb, but McClure, fighting failing radio reception, turned a few seconds late, just enough to vanish from the rest. The Wildcat was rugged, one of the toughest aircraft in the Navy's arsenal, but it wasn't known for long range. It wasn't a Hellcat. It wasn't a Corsair. Its fuel endurance had limits, and McClure's gauge was already worrying him. He tapped the dial with the back of his glove. It didn't move. 30 gallons, maybe less. Not enough to wander, not enough to climb blindly, not enough to find a carrier group lost in the fog. He scanned the horizon. Nothing but empty ocean. Then he keyed the radio again. Blue leader, this is Blue 3. Any contact? Over. Static. He tried the emergency frequency. Still nothing. The sky had swallowed him whole. McClure climbed to 6,000 feet, hoping to rise above the fog layer. He broke through into the open, sunlight dazzling him for a brief moment. But he didn't find the squadron. He didn't find the carrier. All he found was the same endless expanse of blue. Time was running out. He checked his map, an oil-stained folded grid of the Philippine Sea, and estimated his drift based on the last known heading of the formation. But wind could shift a small fighter miles off course. He might already be too far from the carrier to pick up its radar signal. Halfway through another check of his instruments, a sharp warning light blinked. Fuel pressure dropping. Damn it, he muttered. If Japanese patrol aircraft found him now, he was dead. If submarines lurked below, he'd be a perfect target as he ditched. And if he bailed out too far from friendly ships, the Pacific would swallow him long before a patrol plane spotted his life raft. Every option ended in death, unless he found a miracle. 4:17 p.m. As McClure banked east to search for a carrier that likely wasn't there, he spotted something, a thin white line cutting across the water far below. A wake. Something was moving. His heartbeat quickened. He dropped altitude slowly, scanning the sea. Then he saw it. A small warship, slicing the waves with purpose. A destroyer. He didn't know its identity. He didn't know whether it belonged to the Navy or to the Imperial Japanese Navy. At that distance, destroyers of both nations shared similar silhouettes. 4 boiler stacks, angular bridges, and tapered bow waves. He descended further. His engine sputtered once, a reminder that time was nearly up. Another 2 minutes passed before he saw it clearly. The ship flew an American flag, a large one. Bright, even in the late afternoon sun. Relief hit him like a physical force. The destroyer was the USS Fisk, DD-842, conducting patrol operations in support of carrier groups operating around Luzon. It wasn't expecting aircraft overhead, least of all a lone Wildcat drifting dangerously low and clearly in trouble. McClure lowered his wheels halfway, not for landing, but to get attention. Then he rocked his wings violently, an aviator's emergency signal. On the deck of the Fisk, lookout teams reacted instantly. Aircraft at low altitude, friendlies by the look. Pilot in distress. Within seconds, sailors sprinted across the deck, pointing up at the descending Wildcat. The ship's captain, Commander R.E. Mick, was rushed onto the bridge. He stared at the small fighter wobbling above the waves. What the hell is he doing out here alone? No one had an answer. The Wildcat circled tighter, now at dangerously low altitude. McClure opened his canopy and waved, an unmistakable SOS gesture. Commander Mick raised his binoculars. His landing gear's down. He's signaling, God help us. He wants to land. A murmur rippled across the deck. On us, sir? The Fisk was a destroyer, not a carrier, not even an escort carrier. Its aft deck was barely 70 feet long, cluttered with depth-charge racks, winches, and anti-submarine gear. No landing wires, no arresting gear, no flat surface, no clearance. Landing on it was suicide. Every man on the bridge thought the same thing. This pilot is about to die. McClure circled again. His engine coughed violently. Black smoke burped from the exhaust. The prop stuttered. Fuel starvation. The next time the engine quit, it wouldn't come back. Over the roar of the ship's engines, the captain shouted, "Clear the aft deck! Throw everything you can overboard! Move!" Sailors obeyed instantly, shoving gear, crates, and even a depth-charge rack into the sea. The deck cleared slowly. Never enough, but better than nothing. Commander Mick grabbed the bridge microphone. "Pilot of the Wildcat, this is Captain Mick of the Fisk. You cannot land. I repeat, you cannot land. Ditch alongside and we'll haul you in." McClure didn't respond. He lowered his landing gear fully. He straightened his approach. The destroyer crew realized the truth. He wasn't ditching. He wasn't waiting. He wasn't asking permission. He was going to land. Every sailor on the USS Fisk froze as the Wildcat lined up with the ship's narrow stern. 4 feet too far left, he'd clip the superstructure. 4 feet too far right, he'd tumble into the sea. Touchdown too slow, he'd stall and crash. Too fast, and he'd punch straight through the ship like a battering ram. He came in low, engine sputtering, propeller spinning unevenly. A sailor later recalled, "It looked like a wounded bird trying to land on a knife blade." McClure throttled back. The ship pitched slightly in the waves. Spray lashed across the deck. The Wildcat descended. Lower, lower, lower. Landing on a destroyer wasn't just improbable. It was physically impossible. The deck was too short to stop a fighter with no arrestor hook. Unless... McClure made a split-second decision. He aimed not for the flat, but for the one part of the ship that could trap a Wildcat, the stern's metal safety net and rail system. He would crash, controlled, but still a crash. Better than the ocean, better than sharks, better than disappearing forever into the Pacific. He pulled back slightly on the stick, adjusting for the Fisk's pitch. The ship rose on a swell. So did the fighter. Shouts rang out from the deck crew. "He's doing it! He's really doing it!" McClure cut the throttle, and the Wildcat slammed down on the aft deck of the USS Fisk. The moment McClure's wheels hit the destroyer's aft deck, every law of physics seemed to protest. The FM-2 Wildcat was not meant to land without arresting wires, and certainly not on a deck barely the length of 2 city buses. The fighter smashed down hard, metal shrieking against metal, the landing gear buckling slightly under the violent impact. For a split second, everything held. Then the Wildcat lurched forward. Momentum carried it straight toward the aft rail, the fighter's tail swinging as the ship rolled with the waves. Sailors dove out of the way, boots skidding on wet steel as the fighter roared toward the stern. Someone screamed, "Grab him! Stop that plane!" A dozen sailors sprinted toward the Wildcat, ropes in hand, ready to throw themselves onto the aircraft if they had to. They had seconds, maybe less, before the fighter went over the edge and dragged McClure into the sea. The Wildcat skidded another 10 feet, another 5, another 2. And then the miracle happened. The right wing clipped the destroyer's depth charge rack supports. A set of thick steel arms welded into the deck. The collision snapped the rack from its moorings, sending metal and bolts across the deck in a shower of sparks. But it also did something else. It stopped the fighter. The fuselage jolted to a halt, crushed against the mangled metal supports. The propeller chewed into the deck, snapping 2 blades and sending fragments spinning across the ship. The entire aircraft shuddered violently as the engine coughed and died. Silence fell. Then the destroyer crew erupted into shouts. "He did it! He's alive! Get the pilot out!" Smoke curled from the Wildcat's engine cowling. Fuel dripped dangerously close to glowing metal. Sailors didn't wait for orders. They swarmed the plane, climbing onto the wreckage, grabbing the canopy frame and smashing at it with wrenches and tools. "Canopy's jammed! Get a pry bar! Move!" McClure, dazed from the crash, blinked as sailors' faces appeared above him, grimy, frantic, and wide-eyed with disbelief. He tried to push the canopy himself, but it refused to budge. A bosun's mate wedged a steel bar into the frame. "1, 2, heave!" The canopy snapped loose, sliding back with a metallic crack. 2 sailors reached in, unbuckled McClure's harness, and pulled him out. "Easy, easy! He might be hurt." But McClure stood on shaking legs, gripping the arms of the sailors for balance. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, and his entire body trembled from adrenaline. He looked around in a daze. The ocean. The destroyer. The twisted remains of his Wildcat. He was alive. A young seaman slapped him on the back and shouted, "Sir, that was the craziest damn thing we've ever seen." McClure managed a weak grin. "Yeah," he rasped. "You and me both." News traveled fast on a warship, and within minutes the entire crew of the USS Fisk appeared on deck. Gunners, engineers, cooks, radio men. They crowded around the battered fighter, pointing, laughing in disbelief, shaking their heads at the insanity of what they had just witnessed. A petty officer muttered, "Hell, sir, you could have just radioed us. We'd have tossed you a rope." McClure shrugged, still dizzy. "My radio was dead." Another sailor asked, "Why didn't you ditch?" McClure's face grew sober. "Fuel tanks were nearly dry. If I ditched, the engine would have quit before I was out of the cockpit. I wouldn't have gotten far." The sailor whistled low. Commander Mick stepped onto the deck. He approached McClure, hands on his hips, expression a mixture of irritation, awe, and relief. "You know," he said, "if you'd killed half my crew with that stunt, I'd have thrown you overboard myself." McClure straightened, instinctively bracing for a reprimand. "But," Mick's stern face cracked into a grin, "son, that may be the damned finest bit of flying I've ever seen." Sailors cheered. McClure finally let himself breathe. With the adrenaline fading, the crew began inspecting the aftermath. It wasn't pretty. The aft deck looked like it had been mauled by a mechanical beast. Steel rails twisted into corkscrews. Depth charge equipment scattered and bent. Propeller blades embedded in the wooden decking oil streaks pooling beneath the fuselage. A long smoking skid trail gouged across the steel surface. One sailor joked, "Sir, you did more damage to our destroyer than the Japanese ever did." Another chimed in, "And you wrecked your own damn plane doing it." McClure grimaced at the Wildcat. "Better the plane than me," he said. Commander Mick nodded. "Agreed." But we need to make sure that plane doesn't become a hazard. Within minutes, damage control crews secured the wreck. Fuel lines were disconnected. Ammunition was removed. Fire suppression teams stood ready. One option remained: dumping the wreckage into the sea. But not yet. Not before the Navy documented this insane landing. McClure followed Commander Mick to the wardroom, where he was given water, coffee, and a moment to sit down. His hands still trembled. His flight suit shook from adrenaline, but he answered every question as clearly as he could. Mick asked, "When did you realize you were separated?" "About 5 minutes after entering the fog bank." "Radio?" "Static." "Fuel?" "Below 30 when I spotted your wake." "You could have ditched." McClure met the captain's gaze. "With the sea state that high? And sharks?" "I'm not ashamed, Captain. I wanted a fighting chance." Mick nodded slowly. "That decision probably saved your life." McClure swallowed. "And almost cost yours." Mick laughed. "Son, if I'd been in your place, I'd have done the same. Hell, I might have hit us harder." McClure smiled for the first time. When McClure returned topside, the sky was stained orange by the setting sun. The wind blew cold across the deck, carrying the smell of salt and engine oil. The sailors were still buzzing with excitement. "That'll be a story for the grandkids." "First plane we've ever seen land on a tin can." "Should have painted a runway for you." McClure stopped at the edge of the deck, looking back at the Wildcat, bent, broken, and battered, but still recognizable. A strange mix of pride and sadness welled up in him. That aircraft had kept him alive through flak, fighters, and storms. And now, its last act had been to save his life one more time. Commander Mick walked up beside him. "We'll need to push her overboard soon," he said quietly. McClure nodded. "She deserves a proper burial." Mick smiled. "I'll give you the honors." The next morning, after photographs and inspection were complete, the crew gathered on the aft deck. McClure climbed onto the battered fuselage and placed his hand on the side of the cockpit. He whispered, "Thanks for bringing me home." A few sailors wiped at their eyes. Commander Mick raised his hand. "All right, men. Let's give this lady a send-off." Sailors pushed. The Wildcat groaned as it rolled backward. Over the mangled rails, down the sloped stern, and slipped into the Pacific with one final splash. McClure stood at attention until the ripples faded. Later that afternoon, the Fisk finally regained radio contact with the USS Munda. The carrier group had been searching for McClure. The message sent back to the carrier's air group read, "Your pilot is safe. Arrived aboard in unconventional fashion." When the details arrived, the Munda's air officer reportedly shouted, "He did what?" Word of McClure's impossible landing traveled faster than any destroyer could sail. By the time the USS Fisk, DD-842, rejoined the task group the following day, messages were already circulating up and down the fleet, half disbelief, half laughter, and half outrage, all mixed together in the strange math of wartime rumor. A pilot had landed on a destroyer without permission, without orders, without any right to expect to survive. It was the kind of story Navy brass normally dismissed as sailor gossip, except this time there were photographs, eyewitness accounts, and a destroyer captain with a twisted deck railing and a missing depth charge rack to prove it. When McClure was transferred back to the USS Munda, he wasn't greeted with punishment, but something even worse, a formal hearing. Not a court-martial, not a reprimand, but a review panel. Because the Navy had a question it needed answered. Had McClure risked a ship unnecessarily? Or had he performed a miracle that saved his life under the only conditions that made sense? When McClure stepped aboard the Munda, sailors lined the flight deck. As he passed, A few slapped him on the back. One yelled, "Hey! Look out! No destroyers on deck today!" Another shouted, "How many feet of runway you need this time, Ace?" McClure managed a tired smile. He still felt soreness along his ribs from the crash, and his right ankle throbbed from bracing on the rudder pedals during impact. But deep down, he worried. If the Navy thought he'd endangered a ship, they could ground him, or worse. As he reached the ready room, the Air Group Commander, Sea Dr. Lewis, stood waiting. No smile, no jokes, just a look of controlled disbelief. "Lieutenant," Lewis said, "you've really outdone yourself this time." McClure saluted. "Sir, I can explain." Lewis held up a hand. "Oh, you'll get your chance. Trust me." McClure entered a cramped briefing room aboard the carrier. 3 officers sat behind a metal table. Sea Dr. Lewis, Air Group Commander, Captain Marshall, Ship's Commanding Officer, Rear Admiral Kincaid, Task Group Staff. A stenographer sat in the corner, typing steadily. McClure stood before them, hands behind his back, waiting. Lewis opened the session. "Lieutenant Robert McClure, you are here so we can determine whether your actions yesterday were justified under emergency conditions." He glanced at the papers in front of him. "Or whether you nearly killed yourself and the crew of the Fisk through reckless improvisation." McClure swallowed. "Sir, my radio was out, fuel was almost gone, and the sea state—" "We'll get to that," Lewis interrupted. "First, sit." McClure obeyed. The Admiral leaned forward. "Start from the beginning, Lieutenant, and do not leave anything out." McClure told them everything. The fog, losing the formation, tapping the fuel gauge desperately, the useless radio, the terror of the empty horizon, the moment he spotted the destroyer's wake, his attempts to signal, the decision not to ditch. When he described the final moments before landing, the room fell silent. "I knew I couldn't ditch in that sea state," McClure said. "A Wildcat sinks fast. I wouldn't have gotten clear before the cockpit filled. And if sharks didn't get me, exposure would." The Admiral nodded curtly. "You still risked hitting the stern and sinking the Fisk." "Yes, sir," McClure admitted. "But I aimed for the depth charge rack supports. They were the only immovable structure strong enough to stop me." Captain Marshall raised an eyebrow. "You intentionally hit part of the ship?" McClure nodded. "It was the only way to bleed speed." Lewis looked at the Admiral. "Sir, that's either insane or genius." The Admiral sighed. "In the Navy, those are sometimes the same thing." A knock sounded at the door. "Enter," Lewis said. Commander R.E. Mick, captain of the USS Fisk, stepped inside, still smelling faintly of salt spray and engine lubricant. He stood beside McClure and saluted. "Gentlemen," he began, "I believe I can help clear the matter." The Admiral gestured. "Proceed." Mick looked directly at McClure. "When I first saw him circling my ship, I thought he was dead already. His engine was coughing. He was too low to bail out. He couldn't ditch safely." He turned back to the board. "Let me be absolutely clear. If that boy had ditched, we would be burying him right now, or hunting sharks." The room shifted. Even the stenographer paused typing. Mick continued. "And when he lined up for landing, I realized something else. He was doing the only thing that gave him a fighting chance. And we did everything we could to help him survive it." Lewis tilted his head. "You support his decision?" Mick nodded. "Wholeheartedly. He saved his own life, and he didn't kill any of my men. Hell," he cracked a grin, "most of them were cheering for him." The Admiral raised his eyebrows. "Well, that's unusual testimony." Mick shrugged. "Sometimes the enemy isn't the Japanese. Sometimes it's the ocean. And sometimes the ocean tries to kill a man harder than any bomber." Rear Admiral Kincaid tapped a pencil on the table. "Lieutenant," he said, "let's get to the heart of this. Did you land on the Fisk because you believed it was the Only way to survive? McClure answered without hesitation. Yes, sir. And if the same conditions occurred again, would you do it again? McClure paused. Every man in the room watched him. Finally, he said quietly, if ditching meant certain death, and the only other option was landing on a destroyer, then yes, sir, I would. The room stayed silent. Then the Admiral leaned back, exhaling. Well then, he said, I think we've heard enough. The officers stepped into a side room to deliberate. McClure waited, his heart pounding. 10 minutes passed, then 15, then 20. Finally, the panel returned. Rear Admiral Kincaid stood. Lieutenant McClure, this board finds that your actions were justified under emergency wartime conditions. McClure's shoulders sagged with relief. The Admiral continued, you demonstrated exceptional airmanship under extreme duress. Your landing, while unconventional, unapproved, and not recommended under any circumstances, was the correct decision for the survival of your aircraft and life. A faint smile crept across Lewis's face. In short, Kincaid said, you disobeyed every regulation in the book, and we're giving you credit for it. The sailors in the hallway outside erupted in cheers as the door opened. The legend of the destroyer landing was now official. The Navy issued a brief communication. Lieutenant McClure executed an emergency deck landing on USS Fisk under hazardous conditions. No personnel lost. Aircraft subsequently jettisoned. What the report didn't say, but every sailor soon repeated, was the truth. He landed a combat fighter on a destroyer, on purpose, and survived. Within weeks, the story spread across the Pacific. Pilots debated whether it was skill or insanity. Destroyer crews bragged that their ship could do what carriers were made for. Mechanics joked that the Wildcat should earn a Purple Heart. And every captain quietly prayed no pilot ever tried it on their ship again. McClure returned to duty with a new nickname whispered across the carrier. Deckless. The pilot who didn't need a runway. When McClure walked out of the hearing room and back into the corridor of the USS Munda, he expected the momentary heroism to fade. Pilots did brave things every day. Men died every hour. Legends came and went like ocean waves. But he had underestimated sailors. When the hearing door opened, a crowd of deckhands, radio men, ordnance crews and pilots erupted in cheers, loud enough to echo through the hangar bay. There he is, the destroyer ace. Well done, Lieutenant. McClure stopped, startled. He had never been cheered before, not like this. Not as though he had just done something impossible. A mechanic shouted, Hey, Lieutenant, you want us to paint destroyer qualified on your next plane? The crowd roared with laughter. McClure blushed, rubbing the back of his neck. I'd prefer a carrier next time, he muttered. Another voice yelled, How about a submarine, Lieutenant? You can park it on the conning tower. More laughter. What he had done, terrifying, reckless, unimaginable, had now become a piece of fleet folklore. And sailors loved folklore almost as much as they loved coffee, cards, and complaining about officers. That evening, as McClure sat on his bunk in the ready room, a young ensign approached with a sealed envelope. Message for you, sir, from Admiral Kincaid's office. McClure's stomach tightened. He opened it carefully. The contents were brief, just 2 paragraphs, typewritten cleanly. Lieutenant McClure, your emergency landing aboard USS Fisk represents an extraordinary demonstration of aeronautical judgment and skill under life-threatening conditions. Your decision saved your life without loss to U.S. Navy personnel. The landing, while unconventional, has been reviewed and deemed necessary. Signed, Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid. McClure stared at the paper for a moment. It wasn't a commendation, but it wasn't a reprimand. It was something stranger, rarer, and infinitely more meaningful. It was respect. A few days later, the Munda received a mail drop. Pilots crowded eagerly around the delivery station. Letters from home were rarer than victories. McClure didn't expect anything. His parents in Chicago only received updates sporadically. But one letter bore familiar handwriting. He opened it. Inside was a short note from his younger brother, Jimmy. Bob, we heard a rumor you landed on a destroyer. Are you out of your mind? Mom says if you ever try that again, she'll march to the Pacific and drag you home by your ear. Proud of you. Jimmy. McClure laughed. His first real, unguarded laugh since the incident. The news had traveled even faster than he thought. 2 weeks later, while McClure was prepping for another flight, a photographer from Naval Press approached him. You the destroyer pilot? He asked casually, camera around his neck. McClure sighed. That's what they tell me. You mind reenacting a couple poses near your new Wildcat? My new one? The one that hasn't been smashed into a ship yet? The photographer grinned. Exactly that one. McClure returned to regular flight duty quickly. The Pacific War did not slow for anyone, not for heroes, not for survivors, not for miracle landings, but life changed in small ways. In the ready room, younger pilots asked him endless questions. How did it feel? Were you scared? How close were you to ditching? Would you do it again? He answered politely at first, but eventually he boiled it down to one simple truth. I didn't want to die in the ocean. On the flight deck, crew members made a running joke of laying out a strip of white cloth before he took off. His runway, barely 50 feet long. When he returned from missions, men shouted, "Don't land on us, sir. The destroyer's that way. Check your fuel before you try anything." He took it in stride. Better to be teased than forgotten. Even pilots from other carriers, when they visited, sought him out. They shook his hand as though touching a talisman. One Hellcat pilot said, "Lieutenant, every aviator owes you a drink for proving we don't need to ditch just because the book says so." McClure shrugged. "I don't recommend it." The pilot laughed. "No one recommends getting lost in the Pacific." Weeks later, McClure was summoned to the ship's administrative office. A stack of papers lay on the yeoman's desk. "This came through official channels," the yeoman said. "It's a forwarded memo." McClure scanned the top line. "To Navy Department, Bureau of Aeronautics subject, emergency landing by FM-2 Wildcat on DD 842. His eyes narrowed. He continued reading. The memo described the incident in clinical detail. Fuel starvation, fog dispersal, carrier separation, destroyer sighting, unassisted deck landing, controlled collision with aft equipment, no loss of life, total loss of aircraft, survival of pilot. But the final line struck him. This incident, while extraordinary, shall not be considered a precedent for landing single-engine aircraft on destroyers. McClure laughed out loud. The Navy wanted everyone to know that just because it happened once didn't mean anyone should ever try it again. He folded the memo and walked out, shaking his head. 3 weeks after the landing, a package arrived addressed to McClure. From CMDR Mick, USS Fisk, to Lettre Robert McClure, USS Munda. Inside was a small square of twisted metal, painted navy grey, scorched on the edges. A handwritten note accompanied it. "Lieutenant, this used to be part of my depth charge rack. I figured it belonged to you more than to the sea." Mick. McClure held the metal piece in his hand, turning it over slowly. This was the object that had saved his life. He placed it inside his locker and kept it there for the rest of the war. When WWEDS finally ended in August 1945, McClure went home like thousands of others, quietly, anonymously, without medals pinned across his chest. He resumed life as an ordinary man, married, had children, worked civilian jobs. He never bragged, never sought attention, but on Navy ships for decades afterward, whenever the seas rolled hard and flight ops grew dangerous, someone always told the story. There was once a pilot who landed a Wildcat on a destroyer. No arresting gear, no permission, no runway, just guts. Some believed it, some didn't. Most thought it exaggerated. Until 1961, when the USS Fisk's captain, older now, but still sharp, spoke at a naval veterans dinner and said, "Every word of it is true. I saw it with my own eyes." The room fell silent, then erupted in applause, and so the legend of Lieutenant Robert McClure, the pilot who didn't need a runway, became part of the Navy's unofficial history. The kind passed down not in books, but in stories whispered over coffee, on dark midwatches, on endless seas. A story of desperation, courage, and impossible skill. The day one man chose not to die and landed instead on a knife blade of steel. McClure humored him for a few minutes, leaning against the wing, sitting on the cockpit edge, pointing at the horizon. Standard fare. He thought nothing of it. But months later, after the war, sailors all over the Pacific would informally circulate a photo of McClure leaning casually against his Wildcat, grinning like a man who had cheated death. Across the bottom, someone had hand-scribbled, "This man doesn't need runways.